The Storming Archives, Book 2, Portal Stormer. Chapter 1, A New Journey. Delwyn fell. Straight as a pin, she did not tumble, she did not scream. She smiled all over until she realised that she was falling. Then the long gasp froze her lungs. There was no air rushing past, so she couldn't judge by the wind. It was as dark as a dreamless sleep, so she couldn't judge by passing objects. There was only the sensation of the descent. Her hair up on end, buffeting about, making a gentle sound like sheets drying on a line. As she strained her eyes downwards to see, the tears worked their way up to her forehead, but somehow she knew that she would come to no harm. As she realised this, her hair fell down her back and around her shoulders. She was still suspended in the air, floating in a dark space and moving her hands and feet around as though under water. She found that she could twist and turn, so she looked here and there, trying to get an idea of what realm or what part of one soul she was in, if she was in the dream world at all. The whole space was still cloaked in darkness. Then she heard from the distance a soft swooshing noise like millions of bubbles being produced from something or things being propelled. She strained her eyes and ears to see and hear, but she couldn't determine where it or they were coming from. Closer and louder now, she could tell that the sound was definitely bubbles, but from what or who? She opened her mouth to speak, but a huge bubble popped out and wafted in front of her face, then rose up and drifted away. Momentarily distracted by this, she didn't see the swarm heading straight for her. When her eyes did focus, she froze in terror. It was hard to compute what she was looking at, as it was a large mass, bubbling and surging towards her. The sound was deafening. She noticed that they were multicoloured, and individual elements were parting in the middle, preparing to surround her. As they engulfed her inside their ranks, she saw what they were. Thousands of seahorses. She didn't realise at first, but they were moving her along with them. She was so taken with how adorable they were and how hard they were working to keep her inside their seahorse taxi. When she stopped admiring them, she peered out of a crack in their formation and saw a massive coral reef in front of them. The colours were overwhelming, and the shapes and sizes dazzled her. She saw giant clams and beautiful sponges, crystalline seaweed and majestic starfish. Delwyn and the seahorse taxi travelled up and over the reef to what looked like a giant platform as big as a football field. It was a rusty red and was circled with green anemones. Floating around the edges at various levels in rings the same size as the platform were thousands of ornate mirrors. Their frames differed in shape and colour, including all the hues in the spectrum. In the centre of the platform was a mini coral reef with a dark purple mist floating through it. The seahorses brought Delwyn to the reef and she was able to land on her feet, surprised that she could stand as though on solid ground. She was breathing air like on earth, but she assumed, in one soul. The seahorses all dispersed and each one flew off to a corresponding mirror according to their colour. They bobbed up and down in front of each respective mirror as though fascinated with themselves. As Delwyn watched the seahorses watching themselves, she didn't notice the purple mist shift behind her. It slowly started swirling into a gentle tornado, and after a minute she felt the pull of the current. It made her hair flow backwards, but she didn't want to turn around. She'd already had too many surprises and did not feel like running for her life. As she stubbornly contemplated alternatives, the purple tornado was building into a more solid whirlpool, and Delwyn's body was slowly being drawn into it, as a familiar hissing noise filled her ears. There was no use fighting it any longer. She spun around and saw the whirlpool lift up and out of the mini reef, and then zoomed at her with shocking velocity. Before she could scream, it evaporated, and Varun was floating in front of her, triumphant and magnificent in all his glory. He was every shade of purple imaginable, from his snout to the end of his tail, from the deepest plum to the palest lilac. His eyes were cobalt blue and shining magnificently. Obviously quite proud of himself, he exclaimed, "Aha! It is I, Varun!" He thrust his webbed hands in the air with a theatrical flourish and was swishing his regal tail for good measure. Delwyn laughed and said, "Of course it is! Who else could it be?" She continued laughing as he dropped his hands in defeat, the sparkle in his eyes fading fast. "You couldn't have known for sure, silly woman," he pouted. "At first I was worried, but your vain little friends gave me a hint." Delwyn turned and gestured to the mirror-gazing seahorses. Varun chuckled and said, "I suppose so, but they're not admiring themselves, Delwyn. They're keeping watch for me." Delwyn frowned and looked back at the bobbing seahorses. "What are they watching?" she asked, puzzled. Varun smiled with his eyes and the sparkle returned. "Why, all the dreamers, of course. You can't be too careful these days." "Careful? What could dreamers possibly do?" she asked, bewildered. "I was hoping you'd ask me that," he responded cheekily, taking her by the hand and floating them over to the mirrors. When they arrived at the edge, the seahorses became animated, and Varun cooed like a mother to them, gently waving his hands over their heads, encouraging them with soft stroking and tickles. "Well?" asked Delwyn, exasperated. He turned to her and raised an eyebrow. "Well, what?" "What's the answer? What could dreamers do that would require the need to be careful?" She had forgotten how annoying Varun could be with his childish riddles and silly games. He roared with laughter, holding his belly and shaking his head. "Oh, how delicious! Oh, I'm not going to tell you yet. You haven't been initiated, silly woman." Initiated? Into what? She almost didn't want to know. She'd been away for a long time, in the psych unit and with Greg. It was strange how she felt as though it was only a split second since the last time they were standing in front of her mountain, where Varun had told her that she was a portal stormer. "I thought you told me that I was already a portal stormer. What is the initiation for?" She was tired of tests and riddles, and as she became more agitated, a peculiar bubbling hiss, like a childish version of Varun's hissing, arose. It didn't take her long to realize that it was coming from his seahorses. She looked around and saw that they had all turned away from their mirrors and were looking at her, shushing her at the same time. "Now, see what you've done." Varun grabbed her hand again and dragged her away as the seahorses went back to their business. "I will discuss it with you somewhere more private. Honestly." They floated away to a cavern beyond the platform, which was darker and cooler in temperature. Delwyn could see that it was a cafe. There were tables and chairs with a long bar down the left side. No one else was there apart from the waitress, who had her back to them. Varun floated over to a table and told Delwyn to sit down. "You drink tea, don't you?" he asked politely. "You're very odd, Varun." She smiled and thought about the irony of the fact that she was back where she wanted to be, despite any danger that could be lurking around the corner. "And you're very rude. I asked you if you want tea, woman." His haughtiness made her smile more, but she nodded and said, "Yes, please. China black, strong, with milk, and no sugar." "Well, you'll have to make do with dragonfly wing. You want China black? Go back to Alethea." He snorted and turned his back on her, taking off to the bar and snapping his fingers at the waitress. When she turned around to serve him, Delwyn gasped. It was Daphne, Delwyn's anima, or Delwyn personified, or Delwyn's idea of womanhood. It was so confusing, but she couldn't help staring at her. Daphne looked over Varun's shoulder and then smiled and waved at Delwyn. It all seemed so regular and normal, but bizarre at the same time. Varun came floating back, and Delwyn nearly fell out of her chair. His face had morphed into a human face. He was handsome even though his nose was long. He had wavy black hair and still had the lower body of a seahorse, and his arms and torso were still human. "What's happened to you? Why did your face change?" She was flabbergasted and continued staring at him out of sheer fascination. Varun clicked his fingers and a mirror appeared in his hand. He studied himself closely and then said, slightly unsure, "Well, where we are about to go calls for me to be in human form. The potion your female archetype gave me is slowly transforming me. Soon I'll have the silly appendages that come out of the abdomen, and I'll be able to walk like you." Delwyn sat staring with her mouth open. There were so many questions. As she tried to organise them sensibly, Daphne came over with a tray of food and drink. She was still beautiful, with her long black hair in a French twist, and wearing a crimson and satin dress that swept the floor as she walked. "Good to see you, Delwyn, and a portal stormer no less." "Silence!" Varun bellowed, but she ignored him with a roll of her eyes and a snarl of her full red lips. "Oh, suck it up, shark bait!" She spat at him and laughed. Delwyn couldn't help sniggering too. It was hilarious to see Varun with a human face, especially being bombastic and ridiculous. "We'll see who's shark bait serving, wench! Begone with you! We have important business to discuss." He snatched the tea off the tray and passed the plate of food to Delwyn. The women continued giggling and Delwyn decided to push it further. "Oh, this is delicious, or it looks delicious. What is it?" She smiled at Daphne, enjoying herself immensely. "Bulrush pancakes with buttercup syrup and a side of angelica chips." "All right!" Varun's head transformed into the head of a great white shark, complete with gnashing teeth, lunging first at Daphne and then at Delwyn. They squealed in terror as he raged at them, but they quickly lost their fear and started giggling again. "Oh, Varun," chuckled Daphne. "Must you be so ferocious?" She sauntered over to the bar, looking back at Delwyn with a wink. Delwyn tried to regain her composure as Varun slowly changed his head back to humanoid. "That's enough horseplay for one day," he fumed. "I'm sorry, Varun, really." Delwyn reached out to touch his arm, but he pulled it back with a wince. "Sorry doesn't cut the mustard. Drink your tea." He passed the cup to Delwyn. She could see the long, thin dragonfly wings floating on the top. She made a face and shook her head. "I don't think I'd like it." Varun sighed and pinched the space between his eyes with his fingers. Delwyn noticed that his fingers weren't webbed. "Hey, your hands are normal." Varun looked at his hands and said slowly, "I've told you before, horses eat hay, and normal would be webbed. However, yes, I am transforming." He got up from the table and looked down at his legs, jumping back and forth, testing them out. "Look at me! I am an insect." "What?" said Delwyn, starting to laugh again. Daphne was rinsing out the glasses and wrinkled her nose at him. "I have legs like an insect, or a human, you know, like you. Ha-ha!" He walked around the table like a jaunty puppet, stepping carefully, toe heel, laughing and clapping his hands. It was then that Daphne dropped the glasses she was rinsing, and Delwyn shrieked. Varun stopped dead in his tracks and stared at the women, wondering what was wrong. Delwyn pointed to his nether regions, shielding her eyes. "No pants! You need pants, Varun!" Daphne started cleaning up the glasses, and with a click of his fingers, Varun was wearing a fine pair of black tweed slacks. "Excuse me," he said haughtily and sat down, not the slightest bit embarrassed. After a few minutes, the blush left Delwyn's cheeks, as it had been a while since she had seen something of that size. In her panic, she took a sip of the tea, which was delicious and tasted like hot toffee. They ate in silence, and when they finished, she remembered the questions. "Where are we going, and why do you need to be in human form?" She had a horrible flash in her mind about the possibility that they might be going back to Earth. She noticed that she was feeling a little peculiar. It wasn't necessarily in a bad way, but it was like being incredibly awake and sedate at the same time, like when she was astral travelling. Varun sat up and cleared his throat, looking at her, which was unnerving to say the least. It was as though he was trying to find the right words, but also like he was seeing into her soul. "Well, you know that we are in the land of dreams, correct?" "Yes, one soul." The alertness was sharper now, but the buzzing warmth in her bloodstream confused her. "Right, one soul. That's one name for it, the usual name." He cocked his head to the side as though he was thinking about how to phrase the next part of his answer. Delwyn was still trying to get used to seeing him in human form. "One soul, the land of dreams, is one of many realms in our system." Delwyn interrupted him. "So there is a god then, who reigns over our system?" she asked excitedly. Varun held out his hands to ward her off. "I'm not allowed to answer that question, Delwyn. As a portal stormer, you have to discover that for yourself." "But why? That doesn't make any sense," she whined. "Nothing ever makes any sense when it's not aligned with your motivations," he snapped. "Now, may I continue?" She nodded, still annoyed. "Good." He sat back in his chair and took a deep breath, obviously still getting used to his human body. "Each realm has what you might call keepers or guardians, perhaps even rulers, but they are known as Urals. Each Ural has a different name, according to the realm they preside over. As a portal stormer, you will meet each Ural of each realm." The thought of this dazzled her. She started paying even closer attention. "First, you must be properly initiated, which means that you have a task to complete. In order to understand that task, you need to meet the Ural of one soul. The reason for this is, you are the first human to enter one soul in physical form, and you have already accessed the other realms. The Ural of one soul is very interested in you, but the rules dictate that a portal stormer has to complete the set task in order to be granted the status of portal stormer. Do you understand?" Varun peered into Delwyn's face, seemingly searching for signs of stupor. The tea had been strong, but he knew that Delwyn was used to substances that interfered with comprehension, having been exposed to them on Aletheia. She nodded and said, "Yes, strangely enough I do." Delwyn felt strange as well, but she was amped and ready for anything. "Then we shall go to see the Ural. You probably know of him by name." He got up and took Delwyn by the hand, leading her out the back of the cafe. Daphne was already gone, and they walked out of the back door into a green field on a foggy morning. "How would I know his name?" Delwyn asked. "Oh, come on. You're a smart woman, Delwyn. Think." Delwyn frowned at him, still getting used to him as a human. "I'm trying, but I've never met him." Varun smiled sarcastically and said teasingly, "The ruler of the world of dreams? Who might that be?" She stopped in her tracks and stared at Varun, her mouth agape. "You don't mean Morpheus?" she said, amazed. "The one and only." He smiled and clapped his hands together as the fog started wafting around with a disturbance. A whoosh moved the fog like intermittent wafts from a huge fan. "What is that?" asked Delwyn, not believing that she wasn't afraid. Before Varun could answer, they saw a huge crimson winged horse touch down. Then the fog completely cleared. She smiled and looked over at Varun, who seemed pleased with their mode of transportation. The horse was a stallion, shiny in the darkest red, almost black, with strong wings that rivaled any bird she'd ever seen. His mane was so long and luxuriant it was almost obscene. Delwyn walked over and reached out her hand to him. He responded by nuzzling his nose against her and dipping his head for rubs and tickles. Delwyn cooed and massaged gently, smiling over her shoulder at Varun, who seemed impatient to get going, but said nothing. She soon allowed Varun to help hoist her up onto his broad back, and then he climbed on in front of her, bringing her left arm around his waist, exclaiming, "Onwards, Paxia, to the shores of the Western Ocean, and don't spare the, well, you know." He turned and winked at Delwyn, who groaned and telepathically apologized to Paxia. She was amazed to hear him respond in her mind with a deep voice saying, "Never apologize for Varun. One day you will understand, Portal Stormer. It was lucky that Varun didn't hear their communication, but Delwyn could never be sure, especially now that she'd privately communed with a flying horse. Her stomach lurched as they soared up into the air. Paxia's wings seemed to stretch out for eternity. When they dipped and swept up and down, she could feel the air rush like a gale. The swooshing sound almost made her feel like her cells were being divided. She continued the telepathic conversation with Paxia as they flew over a patchwork of lands and strange places scattered like jewels beneath them. "Hey, Paxia," she ventured. "Horses eat hay," he whinnied, and Delwyn laughed out loud, then slapped her right hand over her mouth. Varun craned his neck back at her, frowning with his human face, making her laugh even more. "What are you laughing at?" Thinking quickly, she said, "It's exhilarating, I love it." She smiled into his face, but she was already missing his seahorse snout. "Yes, quite," he yelled, re-establishing his grip on Paxia's mane. Delwyn continued her psychic conversation with her new friend. "Paxia, are you related to Pegasus?" He nickered and replied, "I am his shadow." Delwyn gasped, but Varun didn't hear due to the roar of the wind. "His shadow? Please tell me more," she begged. "Think of what you know about the shadow, and you will only know half of me." With that, he descended sharply to narrowly avoid a hang-gliding woman. It was Daphne. She laughed and waved wildly as they sped past her. "Stupid wench!" Varun yelled back at her. She gave him the finger. Delwyn was only momentarily distracted, but her senses were sharpened dramatically with the dragonfly tea, and her thoughts raced with images and facts regarding shadows. She thought about shadow in the aspect of rejected or ignored personality traits and talents. She pondered things such as repressed memories and traumas, giving rise to phobias and character flaws or aberrations. She remembered her studies on Jungian psychology and the process of integration. She wondered what on earth Pegasus could be hiding in his shadow, and why his shadow should exist after all this time. Paxia interrupted her thoughts. "Maybe I hide from Pegasus. That happens, you know." "But why would you do that?" Delwyn asked, shocked and perplexed at the same time. "Maybe I don't want to be integrated. Maybe the shadows want to be individual rather than individuated." He neighed softly to himself, as Delwyn's mind started reeling with the concept of a shadow hiding from their own psyche. She wondered where Pegasus was now that she was quite sure he existed. "He doesn't come to one soul. He's too proud. Most of the archetypes abhor being summoned here by mere mortals, dreaming their dreary dreams." He neighed louder now, as he tilted slightly to the right and angled gently over a huge, colourful market that bore a striking resemblance to Marrakesh. Delwyn could see people rushing here and there, buying and selling a wide variety of handicrafts, clothing, jewellery, and so on. It was twilight now, and the colours were amplified. Varun called out to her, "Delwyn, can you see that wonderful land below? And those glorious smells? I'll have to take you there one day." Delwyn could smell sandalwood, good coffee, incense, myrrh, curries and cumin, oranges, jasmine, rose and musk. It was all mixed into a divine, heady scent that sent her into a dreamlike haze for a few minutes. She heard the snake charmers and the spell was complete. Losing her grip on Varun, she started slipping and sliding to the left. "Delwyn!" Varun yelled and grabbed her in time to drag her back. "Keep your wits about you, silly woman!" Paxia spoke to her mind. "Don't worry, I'll catch you if you fall, Portal Stormer." "Thank you, Paxia. I'll protect your secret if I ever meet Pegasus." She was snapping out of her dazed state and gripped tightly onto Varun, who held her hand firmly. They flew on as twilight melted into the navy blue phase of night. Delwyn saw ahead of them a familiar stretch of shoreline. It was a violet shoreline, with a purple ocean and a black forest leading up to the sand dunes. She tapped Varun sharply on the shoulder. "Varun, is that the beach? The place where I first met you?" she called out. He shrugged nonchalantly. "Maybe it is, maybe it isn't," he responded, barely audible. "I think it is. Why are we coming back here?" She was starting to feel panicked, as though she was about to be delivered back to a point in her life she would rather not repeat. Paxia whispered in her thoughts, "Calm yourself, it's not what you think." He dipped down and skimmed the sea, flying low, with the tips of his wings just breaking the surface of the water every now and again. She could smell the familiar lavender and aniseed, or was it dill? She turned around and could see the cave, but they flew on, past the point where she and Peter had met Varun, where they'd sailed on the pearly boat to the moon. With that thought, she looked up to the sky, and there it was, the pink moon, gently glowing with its rosy light. She was annoyed with Varun and his increased surliness, but she couldn't get up and walk away. She wasn't aware, but she'd started gripping tighter, as though she had a subconscious desire to squash him. He pinched her fingers in retaliation. "Ease off! What's the matter with you?" he growled, sounding tired and grumpy. "Sorry," she replied, trying not to giggle like a naughty child. He turned his face to the right to say, "Well, we're nearly there, so remember to be on your best behaviour, Delwyn. I won't warn you again, and I won't protect you." He snorted for good measure. Okay, I promise," she yelled back, wondering what on earth would happen if she did not behave. Not that they were anywhere near Earth. Paxia started flying to the shore and approached an inlet where there was a huge gate across it, shining in the moonlight. It was black and pearlescent, reflecting the pink beams from the moon, but there was something foreboding about it. It did not have a sign or a flag, but Delwyn could see that both Paxia and Varun knew what it was, since they became sombre and silent as they approached. Paxia was now pacing slowly in the sand and stopped just shy of 20 feet from the gate. Varun turned to Delwyn and said, "This is where we get off. Follow my lead and don't falter." He slid off Paxia's back and took Delwyn's hand. She could see the seriousness in Varun's face, and was it fear? Every now and then he looked over to the gate and back at the moon. "What are you doing?" she whispered. "Checking the time. Now, silence." He held his finger to his lips and then patted Paxia on the rump. Delwyn felt the sand kick up as Paxia swept into the air with his mighty wings, calling out to her mind, "Keep your words to a minimum and agree to everything. I will see you soon, Portal Stormer." With that, he soared off majestically towards the moon. Delwyn looked back at Varun, who was wringing his hands and eyeing the gate nervously. "What now?" she asked. Varun spun around with both fingers to his lips. She realized that he seemed so frail in human form. He was still wearing the black tweed pants, but was shirtless and seemed almost like a crazy vagrant. Then the sand started shifting and shaking. Not sure if it was an earthquake, she ran over to Varun and they fell into each other's arms, both of them quivering like frightened rabbits. "What is that?" she hissed at him. "Who is that would be the appropriate question." Varun was trembling and staring at the gate. Delwyn realized that the shaking ground felt like a succession of massive tremors or the footfalls from a giant. She wasn't wrong. From behind the gate she could see a gigantic bulk of darkness moving closer towards them. She tried to back away, but Varun held on to her, telling her that she had to stay. Normally she would be screaming and running or fainting, but the dragonfly tea must have been doing its work, as she was still afraid, but curious nonetheless. She could see that the thing was a lumbering monster, at least the size of a 10-story building, with only one eye. A cyclops. He dragged his heavy feet to the gate and then stopped, scratched his bald head and stared dumbly at the two of them. He was wearing what looked like the skins of 1,000 black bears, held together by dozens of intricately laced antlers. His pants were made from hundreds of hessian sacks. He was barefoot and had massive leather straps around his thick wrists and was clutching a huge gnarled club in his right hand. Suddenly he boomed, with a voice that sounded like he'd swallowed 1,000,000 skulls.
"Who goes?"
Delwyn squealed, but Varun held her tightly next to him, his sweaty palm squeezing her in fear. We are here to see the Ornity and Morpheus, the Ural. He's expecting us. Varun didn't stammer, but his voice was feeble in comparison to the horrifying sound coming out of the Cyclops' mouth.
I said, who goes?
The Cyclops bellowed, thumping the ground with his club for emphasis as birds shrieked and fled from the trees nearby. Delwyn hissed at Varun, "Tell him who we are!" "Shut up, Delwyn!" Varun sneered at her through gritted teeth, then turned to the monster and tried to raise his voice without sounding facetious. "I am Varun, guardian of one soul. This is Delwyn." He motioned with his head towards her as though she was an afterthought. The Cyclops rumbled and drooled as he spoke.
Delwyn of the realms, my master has been expecting you. But first, a challenge.
He reached down and opened the gate, while Varun and Delwyn turned and ran several steps to make way so they wouldn't be squashed under his feet. Delwyn grumbled to Varun as they scrambled. "A challenge? Is this my initiation?" "No, it is not. He needs to make sure that you are who you say you are. Do what you're told and stop whining." He pinched her arm and pushed her forward, closer to the Cyclops. She nearly fell over trying not to get too close. The Cyclops closed the gate behind him and looked Delwyn up and down. She was wearing what she'd had on when she'd found the last piece of the mirror, her red and faded Indian cotton dress and brown leather sandals, full of sand. Her long black hair was hanging loosely about her shoulders and down to her waist. She'd lost a little weight since she was hospitalized, but retained her voluptuousness. The monster licked his lips, which revolted Delwyn, but she stood her ground and waited for her challenge, whatever it might be. The Cyclops started speaking a little more quietly now, which wasn't saying much. It was still booming, and they could hear what sounded like skulls scraping together in the background.
Delwyn of the realms.
Delwyn couldn't help but interrupt him. "What's your name?" Varun smothered his face with his right hand in frustration. The Cyclops smiled and drooled as no one had ever asked him that before.
I am Brute.
He watched her for a response, and she smiled and said hello, but decided to let him go on. He did.
Delwyn of the realms, you have a challenge before you go through the gate of the Void River. Do you accept, or will you flee?
She looked back at Varun, who raised a sarcastic eyebrow at her. "You're on your own with this one, so don't look at me. I'm merely a spectator." He cocked his head nastily and crossed his arms, hoping to send a message to her that it was time to get serious. She looked up at Brute, who was drooling and smiling kindly at her, but she knew that she truly would be on her own with this one. She gulped and nodded, twisting a strand of hair in her fingers. "Yes, I accept." Brute picked up his club and slammed it into the sand, causing a minor quake that knocked Varun over. He scrambled back up before Delwyn could see. She was focusing on her surroundings as she'd been sealed inside what seemed to be a clear cylinder or tube. Brute and Varun could see in, but she couldn't see out. For all intents and purposes, she'd been transported to another dimension. She was in a familiar hospital bed, and Dr. Boyd was walking out the door, slipping a piece of gum into her mouth. Delwyn was yelling out, "I'm not ready to see her!" Dr. Boyd spun around, chewing on the gum and shaking her head. Delwyn was in her body, reliving the moment, but also screaming in her mind, "I've already been through this! I've already faced my shadow! I integrated this shit! I'm not afraid of this! I'm not afraid of her anymore!" On the outside of the cylinder, Brute watched mutely as Varun started stroking his chin like a psychiatrist observing a patient. On the inside of the cylinder, Dr. Boyd advised in her cool voice, "Delwyn, we've been over this and over this. Whatever happens, you are an adult, and it's time that you faced her and told her, woman to woman, how you feel and what you want. It's the only way you can move on." Delwyn heard the words coming out of her own mouth and was embarrassed for them. "But if I'm not ready, why should I? She's the adult. She's my mother." With that, she heard the clickety-clack of the white pump strutting on the linoleum. There she was in all her ghastly, vapid glory, glaring at her daughter with that rehearsed, hateful stare. She looked down her nose at Delwyn like a bitter taste had infiltrated her mouth. Standing like a stern ghost, she crossed her bony arms across her bonier chest and said in her chilled, clipped voice, "Well, what have you got to say for yourself?" It was as though there were two people inside Delwyn's body, the one from history and the one from the beach. She tried hard to take the old script and turn it around. She was screaming again inside the mind, saying things such as, "Leave me alone!" or "I don't need you!" But the Delwyn from history was crying and gnashing her teeth, begging her mother for mercy. "Please understand. I'm trying my hardest. I've been through a lot." She was squirming around in spiritual agony under the sheets as her mother approached and sat down in the chair next to the bed. The pleading was like oxygen to this hollowed-out vampire. "Always running, running, running. When are you going to grow up, Delwyn?" She sneered in disgust at her daughter. Inside the body, Delwyn raged like a psychotic rhinoceros, wanting so badly to rip through the flesh and rush at her mother. The old Delwyn kept withering and pleading, sobbing and sniffling like a baby. She heard her mother talking about how she was on her own now, how she had no time for a feeble, hopeless loser. All of a sudden, the Delwyn inside remembered her breakthrough. She remembered the Nancy who cried, who'd cuddled into her chest and begged for forgiveness. She found herself saying, out loud, in a calm yet strong voice, "Who hurt you, Nancy?" Her mother stopped the vitriol mid-sentence and glowered at Delwyn. "What did you say?" The old Delwyn was now like a hand puppet controlled by the new Delwyn inside. "Someone must have hurt you to make you so bitter, cold and twisted, to make you so hateful and spiteful, to hate your own flesh and blood so much. Something must have really dug deep to inflict such terrible wounds." As Delwyn spoke, her mother's demeanour became more and more fearful. The chilly facade was slowly replaced by a more human, more fleshed-out person who responded emotionally with every word coming out of Delwyn's mouth. She started reacting verbally. Her voice was even sounding like it was thawing. Don't say that. Please don't, it's not fair. I don't want to think about it. I don't want to talk about them." She put her hands to her ears as Delwyn continued, unravelling her with every sentence. "What happened, Nancy? Who did this to you? What did they do? You can tell me." She was cajoling now, even comforting. "No! No!" Her mother wailed and dropped to the floor, still holding her ears and scrunching herself up into a ball, sobbing and blubbering. Delwyn got out of the bed and sat on the floor next to her mother, stroking her hair, saying, "It's all right now. It's okay." There was a flash of golden light, and she was back at the gate. Brote and Varun had seen it all. The cylinder had disappeared, and they were all standing there in silence. Delwyn wouldn't look at Varun like it was all his fault. She didn't complain to Brote either, as she had a hunch that he had nothing to do with the rules. Brote was wiping away tears and sniffling as he reached out and pushed the black gate open. His booming voice was gentler now.
"Delwyn of the realms, you faced your fears. You may travel the Void River to meet my master."
Delwyn had so many questions about why she had to face her mother all over again, and why she'd had to accept a challenge only to go through a gate to visit a person who had already invited her. Even though Varun had said that Brote had to make sure that she was the one, she could think of hundreds of other memories and fears they could have used to test her, but she wasn't going to say that out loud. As Varun started following them through the gate, Brote abruptly turned him away with a sweep of his powerful left hand.
"No, changeling, you stay here."
Varun was incensed. "What do you mean? I came all this way. I brought her here. I'm the guardian of this realm." Before he could continue, Brote reached down and grabbed Varun by the foot and lifted him up into the air until he was face to face with the Cyclops, albeit upside down. Varun screamed purple murder. "Ah! Put me down! I'll get vertigo!" Brote boomed loudly into Varun's face.
"I say who sees the master, and you don't get to see the master fish food."
who dropped Varun onto the sand like a gentleman would drop a piece of fluff he'd plucked from his shoulder. Varun scrambled to his feet and yelled, "But why? I transformed myself for him! Tell me why!" Broat leaned down and whispered as much as he could whisper,
"I don't like your vibe."
Varun was speechless. Delwyn laughed heartily for the first time in a long time. She liked Broat immensely. They walked through the gate, and as Broat closed it, she turned around and saw that Varun had morphed back into his original form. He was black and fuming, with black smoke billowing out of his eyes. He spun around in a temper and charged into the sea, the water boiling in his wake as he delved further into the depths. She looked up at Broat as they made their way up the inlet and asked, "Will I see him again?" Broat smiled and said,
"Varun will do what Master tells him to do, or—"
He made the universal gesture for a slit throat. Delwyn shivered. Broat stomped ahead of Delwyn, following the inlet until it widened into the river, and the trees thickened into a dark wood. The banks and fields were carpeted with red poppies, and Delwyn was transfixed with the beauty of it until Broat interrupted her thoughts.
"Delwyn, I can go no further."
She turned and saw him scratching his head and motioning with his club towards a boat on the side of the river. It was black with a ring of poppies painted around the edge. How surprised she was when she saw the blue rubber man sitting there, waiting for her. He waved to her and grabbed the oars, ready for her command. She turned to Broat and said, "I know him, but I don't know his name. What is it?" Broat shrugged his massive shoulders and replied,
"Oarsman."
Delwyn went over to Broat's ankle and hugged it as best she could. She looked up at him and saw him looking down, smiling and drooling. Just then, a huge drop fell from his thick lower lip. She dodged it just in time. He laughed like a little child as it splattered on the ground, terribly tickled at the thought of her drowning in his drool. She went over to the boat and climbed aboard with the help of the oarsman. She sat down and looked back as they pushed off and up the river. Broat was waving and finally yelled,
"Look out for sorrow, Delwyn."
"Sorrow?" she yelled back, but they were already on their way and had turned a bend, gliding along steadily into the ever-darkening forest. The oarsman rowed and looked from side to side, occasionally gesturing here and there, but Delwyn couldn't understand exactly what he meant due to his featureless face. "I wish I could understand you," she said, feeling deeply saddened by their lack of a connection. He shrugged as though it was of no consequence, but she grew more morose as they penetrated the forest, travelling along the black river towards the cave of the Ural. She hadn't had time to question Varun or Broat about what to expect or what to do once she arrived, but instead of panicking, she became depressed and decided to lie down in the boat. The oarsman tilted his head to the side quizzically as though confused with her actions, but kept rowing to keep the pace. Delwyn saw the black trees and their branches overhead, passing by quietly as they moved along. Occasionally she saw ravens, watching her with interest, but she continued slipping into the dark melancholy that was taking over her soul. She heard the oars hitting the water and creaking against the boat. She started thinking about Greg and how he must have felt, having been deserted by the woman he loved so desperately. The guilt was powerful in her belly, and the shame holding its hand was dragging its feet, too sad to go on. The tears started seeping out of Delwyn like black rivers down the sides of her face. Her heart sunk deep in her chest, melting into her spine. She thought of all the wretchedness she'd caused in the real world. The real world. Was this real? She'd been running away all her life, to the fairy world, off with the fairies. For what? Like the proverbial dog chasing its tail, achieving nothing and going nowhere. She thought of Gwen, her aunt, and how distraught she must have been when she disappeared. What an awful person she was, to have done that to the woman who'd stood by her side and taken her in when she was down to her last shred of sanity. There was only one solution. She was worthless, like her mother had said for all those years. No one cared anymore, and why should they? She sat up, wiped the black tears off her cheeks, and started climbing over the edge of the boat. She would lose herself in the black void river. It was why she was there, wasn't it? The oarsman suddenly reached out and grabbed her, dragging her in and slapping the back of her head. She turned to look at him and saw him wildly gesturing, frantic and angry with her for succumbing to the sorrow. She remembered Brote's words now, to watch out for sorrow. She fought the oarsman, though, regardless as to what Brote had said. The sadness had taken root and blossomed into a solution that couldn't be ignored. As they struggled and wrestled, a raven who'd been watching the whole scene flew over to the field and scooped up a beak full of poppies, then flew them back to the oarsman. He took them and shook them over Delwyn's face. It wasn't long before she dropped into a deep slumber. Then he continued rowing them to the dwelling of the Ural. The raven journeyed with them, sitting next to the oarsman and watching Delwyn sleep. The raven and the oarsman didn't notice Delwyn leaving her body. She floated ahead of them and landed on the banks, waiting for their arrival. She was glad to be free of her heavy body and the horrible depression that had nearly taken her life. As much as she enjoyed being out of her skin, she wanted to continue living in physical form, at least for a while. There was so much happening and she had to know what being a portal stormer was all about. The oarsman finally pulled up to the bank and tied off the boat. He then gestured to the raven and pointed to Delwyn. She knew what that meant. In that form she could hear him, even though it wasn't actual words he was speaking. She could hear his intentions as she read his mind. He was telling the raven to wake her body up. She tried to fight it, but as the raven squawked in her body's ear, she felt the tug and pull, and all of a sudden she snapped back inside. When she woke up, she jumped straight out of the boat, not wanting anything to do with the void river and its despair. The raven flew up into a tree and watched Delwyn playfully slap the oarsman, who laughed and held his belly, pointing his finger at her and shaking his head. She looked up at the raven and did her own finger pointing, trying not to laugh. "And you! Who asked you?" The raven cawed at her and ruffled its feathers in defiance. Delwyn looked behind her and saw that the banks led up to a steep slope, which plateaued at around 40 feet. There was not a path to be found, but she climbed easily enough and tried not to disturb the poppies that jostled gently in the wind. She saw butterflies and dragonflies racing each other and felt momentarily guilty for drinking the tea. When she reached the top, she stepped up onto the plateau and saw a line of huge red marble pots down each side of the large platform. Fire leapt out of each pot, lighting the way down to the entrance of a large cave. Standing there, she felt foolish, but knew that she had to go in. She'd been invited. She slowly wandered down the middle of the platform, which was made out of white marble. It was cracked here and there, and was designed with images of various deities, inlaid with lapis lazuli. This made her think of Mark and the colour of his eyes, but she pushed him out of her mind and continued walking to the cave. Before she could get to the entrance, she heard a piercing shriek, which nailed her to the spot. Then a huge bat came flying out of the cave, a rich dark brown colour, seeming like it was made out of velvet and leather. She was too afraid to keep looking at it, so she crouched down and hoped that it would keep flying over the plateau. It halted in mid-air and turned around, flapping its huge wings. It was at least 10 feet tall and strong and wild-looking. Its eyes were red and glowing, but she wasn't sure if it was only the reflection of the fire. She stayed down as it gradually moved towards her, still hovering, its wings moving in slow motion. Delwyn realised that there was no use in keeping up the charade, so she carefully stood back up and looked at its face, hoping that it wasn't going to attack. It cocked its head side to side, as though making an observation or sizing her up. It didn't speak or make a sound, but kept studying her like she was an oddity. She decided to say something to show that she didn't mean any harm. "Hello, I'm Delwyn." She smiled, but thought better of putting out her hand. The bat continued hovering and slowly wafting its leathery wings, softly snorting every now and then, but otherwise remained quiet. Before she could say anything else, she heard footsteps behind her. She saw the bat respond only a little as it looked over her shoulder, Mildly curious as to who it could be, she turned her head around and nearly fainted. Greg was there, standing in the entrance of the cave, as plain as day. He smiled his handsome smile, and she saw the shadows of the fire illuminate his green eyes and sandy hair. She called out his name as she ran to him. She felt his warm, strong arms wrap around her, and she melted into his chest. She did miss him. She cried and looked up. Then they kissed like they had when she was first released from the psych unit. Even though she had to put a stop on anything after that, now she was feeling a burning desire for him. He kissed her back and squeezed her to his body. Then she turned around to check for the bat and saw it rise up and fly over the plateau, continuing on its way. She heard Greg say, "Don't worry about him." She looked back at him, still in his work clothes, but clean and smelling like he always had, manly and reeking of aftershave. "Wow, what are you doing here? How did you get here? Oh my God, I can't believe it," she blathered. "You shouldn't," he said calmly, smiling gently at her and still holding her hands. "What do you mean?" she asked, the realization slowly creeping over her. He didn't respond, but kept smiling and holding her hands as she started pulling back, shaking her head. "No, Greg, please." She yanked her hands out of his and stumbled backwards as he turned his back on her and walked into the cave, slowly transforming into something her mind couldn't fathom. Without thinking, she followed him and saw that the cave led down to a massive underground cavern, which was also a magnificent palace made out of polished marble. As she approached the top of the steps, she saw golden statues of every kind of animal down either side of the stairway. The entity had vanished. She strained her eyes, looking all over the palace to see if she could find him. What was it that she saw? First it was Greg, then something inhuman. Not animal, but not a monster. She couldn't get her head around it, but annoyance replaced the fear that had tried to claim a space inside her. She started moving down the steps and craned her neck this way and that, almost missing the magical things surrounding her. At the foot of the stairs was a huge circular carpet that was crimson and gold. There were peacocks strutting around here and there. She saw potted palm trees and large golden bowls full of all kinds of luscious fruits on long marble tables. There was a great ornate harp, golden and inlaid with rare gemstones and pearls, at the end of the largest table, where a variety of velvet chaises and silk cushions were strewn about. Everywhere she looked were objects of luxury and opulence, but she was more concerned with the entity and why it had pretended to be Greg. She'd completely forgotten about the bat, or where she was and why she had come. She called out, "Hello? Where are you?" with more confidence than she usually would have dared. She nearly tripped when she heard the harp start playing on its own. She looked over and saw that no one was near it. Slowly but surely she crept over to it, almost whispering, "Hello? Who's there?" It was playing a gentle, heavenly tune which was bewitching to listen to. Delwyn approached it with her right hand outstretched, marvelling at the workmanship and fondling the exquisite gems and scroll-work down the spine. The music lilted, making magical tingles run up her own spine. She'd fought against closing her eyes with the joy of it. Then she was jerked out of her daze with a hand on her shoulder. When she spun around, no one was there. "Who is it? Who are you?" she demanded. "I'm sick of this. Stop playing games." An ancient male voice roared in her ears as the music stopped.
"And who are you to command me?"
She felt the palace shake with seismic activity. Small clumps of dirt crashed from the ceiling onto the floor. She screamed as she fell onto a blue velvet chaise, trembling with terror. The tremors stopped as soon as they started, but she stayed where she fell, afraid to anger whoever it was any further. She thought of apologizing, but dismissed the idea for fear of appearing trite or silly. Then she heard wings fluttering all around her, but she couldn't see anything. There were no birds flying around, and the peacocks were still on the floor. The fluttering sounds filled the air so loud that she thought the atmosphere would burst. She covered her ears but didn't dare to scream. Turning around to see where it was coming from, she saw that the peacocks were still calmly strutting around, going about their business. She looked up, sideways, back and forth, here and there, but the beating wings were invisible and coming at her from all directions. She started crying, but still wouldn't scream, deciding to endure it until whatever it was showed itself. She wondered if she was being punished for being so impudent. It was relentless, and when she looked up once more, she saw him. He was much larger than a mortal man, at least 10 feet tall and muscular, and so white, like an animated marble statue. The most amazing feature was his winged head. She knew straight away that this was Morpheus. He was descending slowly, the wings on his head also beating slowly, and she noticed that the fluttering noises were subsiding, to her relief. His face was dispassionate, but his eyes were angry and focused on Delwyn as she waited for whatever was going to happen next, gripping the velvet cushion in apprehension. He landed softly on the floor, looming large over her, the wings on his head now folded back. He was wearing what seemed to be a toga, and she sensed something akin to the perfume of myrrh. She wondered if she should stand up or stay seated, and panicked with her indecision. She opened her mouth to speak, to ask, but he interrupted her.
Do not speak.
Feeling stupid, she nodded and kept sitting on the chaise and gripping the cushion, waiting for him to do or say something. She wondered if he was the one who'd pretended to be Greg, but somehow that seemed like too much of a parlour trick for this great being to stoop to.
Stand.
At first she struggled to get out of the chaise, but once she was standing, he grabbed her by the shoulders and lifted her up. The wings on his head opened again as they fluttered and lifted them both into the air, flying them to another part of the palace. Delwyn squealed just a little, but maintained some sense of control. Morpheus placed her on a kind of short pedestal, stood in front of it and closed his wings again. Their faces were now at the same level. Delwyn wondered why this was important for him to speak to her. He did indeed look like a statue, but he was also definitely flesh, albeit milky white face or fleshy marble. She could sense the flesh, as there was something animal and visceral about his presence, but at the same time there was an aura of timelessness and mystery. She did her best not to tremble, but the fear was starting to permeate every cell. She felt that maybe the dragonfly tea was wearing off. When he opened his mouth to speak, she could see that the insides of his mouth and his tongue were also pure white. It was astonishing to witness. He reached out and grabbed her arm roughly, squeezing it as though testing a piece of fruit. It hurt, and she winced, but she wouldn't protest. He pinched her chin and then pinched her skin on her cheek, then poked it with a white finger. His cold white eyes looked deep into hers, and she saw a billion dreams in a flash, making her pass out instantly. As she collapsed, he caught her and flew her over to the chaise she was in when he'd arrived. He placed her there unceremoniously, like he had no knowledge of how to treat a real human. Morpheus had never dealt with a mortal, face to face and in the flesh. He'd been made aware of a human entering one soul in physical form, but thought it was another one of Varun's silly stories. Varun was fond of tall tales and did what he could to appease and entertain his Ural. This time Varun had made good on his promise, and Morpheus was pleased to have the missing piece of the puzzle to offer the realms. However, there was a lot that had to be done, and Delwyn had a lot to learn. Morpheus looked into her soul and could see that she was about to seize. A hypnopompic hallucination was about to take hold, and in this realm she could teleport to any dimension. He would go with her, as he realized that it was the best opportunity to explain what she needed to do. Besides, he wanted to know her on every level.